As I mentioned before, I've had the privilege of bringing a variety of students to Crow Canyon. Brought middle school students. I now have some high school students that are here with me who are part of a class. And a couple of the groups that I've run through here have been privileged enough to be taught by Paul, who you're about to meet, who's gonna present the first topic for today. And Paul is I can say this, recently retired from Crow Canyon. Their loss. But it sounds like they're not really letting him go. They kind of just keep dragging him back in. Super knowledgeable gentleman. He is so good with any person you put in front of him, be it an obnoxious little 6th grader to an obnoxious 80-year-old. Paul will converse with them all and probably leave them a little wiser. And Paul is going to take us on that journey to really talk about those first Kiln conferences that unfolded here. And maybe even segue into where maybe we would want to go from here, type of thing. So I'm going to welcome Paul up here to be your first speaker for the day and pass the microphone.
So, hi, I'm Paul, and I guess, I always take it for granted that the people here know something about Crow Canyon. But let me start by saying, how many people have either been here or know something about, let's do it this way. Who's never been here and knows nothing about the organization? Okay. I guess I better start with that. Okay, Crow Canyon was started, its official anniversary was 1983. It started long before that as a teacher from the Denver area who wanted children to learn outside of the classroom. So every summer he'd bring a group of kids down here. They'd hike, they'd go to the reservation, do service projects. One of his, in his book, he says, we're going to take a car apart and we're going to put it together again. So he was into experiential education. At some point, his school at Crow Canyon became Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. And Crow Canyon is an organization that's dedicated to research and education and working in collaboration as often as possible with Native American people. We did for many years until sort of COVID came along, thousands of students from all over the country, Hawaii, Pennsylvania, all over the place. So we've had literally tens, hundreds of thousands of students here. We also ran an archaeological adult research program where people would come here and they would go through a 1-week program, an introduction to the prehistory of the area. You'd have to take a lab class. You'd have to, have some other classes, and then you worked in the field. So it was a hands-on experience learning about archaeology. Okay. What can I say? COVID came along, things changed a little bit. The buildings are more restricted, so that's part of what we just don't have the staff here to do all the things that if people are coming and going and using bathrooms. So that's part of the restriction here now, is just sort of an outgrowth, and you're all aware of what happened. And then came cell phones, and people got addicted to them, and all that kind of stuff. So we're gonna do hands-on kind of stuff here. So what I want to do is just talk about one of the research things that grew out of Crow Canyon, which we called the Kiln Conference at Crow Canyon. And I'm going to read it because it happened 1991, 30 some years ago, and I just can't remember all those details. So I'm going to try to sort of fill you in on this thing that started as a group of archaeologists and potters to learn about the technologies of prehistoric pottery making and firing, okay? And then we can do some questions at the end. But does anybody have any questions about Crow Canyon before I go any further? Okay. All right, so anyway, the Kiln Conference was originally proposed by Eric Blemon and C.D. Wilson, who were ceramic analysts for the Office of Archaeological Studies down at the Museum in New Mexico, and Meg Heath, who was at that time the Director of Education here. And the purpose was to bring together archaeologists and potters and Native Americans to examine various aspects of ancestral Pueblo pottery manufacturing and technologies. And what they wanted to do was use the data that was available at the time. So we weren't just sort of doing stuff. We wanted to say, okay, this stuff is based on some kind of research. In the 1970s and 80s, very little was known about pottery manufacturing in this area. I mean, all the types were listed. So you could say this is McElmo black and white, or this is, you know, Piedro, or whatever. But nobody really understood sort of how they were working. There were several papers. One of the first was Claudia Helm in 1973. Steve Fuller in 74 published, I can't remember the exact names, but they were excavations that they did in the Yellow Jacket area. Hibbets, Hardin, these were all people that came out of the Dolores Archaeological Project, and they were describing these slab-lined thermal features, okay? There had been a few people, I think Anna Shepard was one, Roberts was another, who proposed that maybe some of these things they were finding on the landscape were being used to fire pottery. But the reason that we didn't, or they didn't, or whoever didn't find any, was based on an ethnographic analogy. Everybody understands what ethnographic means? The way people do things today. So it was sort of a circular thinking that if the ancient people were the ancestors of modern Pueblo people, they should be doing things similarly. Many or most modern Pueblo people do a surface firing. They often use dung, cow, sheep dung, wood, coal, things like that. And if you've ever seen one of those fires, you know, when you're done, there's a big black spot on the ground, but it doesn't take very long for there to be nothing left. So the logic was, if the ancient people were doing it the way the modern people do it, no wonder we're not finding anything, because there's not much left to find, okay? So from that's sort of how things happened. But again, there were these 3 or 4 articles, and people said, well, maybe that's not quite right. So the first Kiln Conference happened in February of 1991, and there was still snow on the ground. And we met in this very room. There was, boy, I bet you not more than 15 or 20 people here. And the first thing we did was we had a sort of a brainstorming where we talked about what does the literature say, how can we sort of interpret that, and then what are we going to do this weekend? And so they proposed 3 different firings, and I can't remember, I mean, I could get in the details, but I don't want to go into it how. But there were 3 different types of firings, all using 2 trench kilns that we built here on campus. They were actually up on that hill, and they're now buried under those buildings. So, you know, there's no way, we wanted to be able to go back and excavate those in the future, but that's not going to happen. But anyway, the sort of the rules were you had to use local clays, something that you could get in this area. There was an ethnobotanist, Karen Adams, and Mark Hovasak was working with her, and they said, well, we're only going to use fuels that would be available. So that would have been pine, juniper, and maybe corn cobs. So at that point, we did, I think, 3 firings that weekend, and we weighed all the fuel and we weighed all the pots. I mean, we put a grid over the kiln. Everything was measured, recorded. We had thermocouples, but unfortunately, the models weren't that great. And these are typical examples of what I would call gray on orange, Mesa Verde gray on orange, and this is what a lot of the pots came out. There just wasn't a lot. So these pots were extremely oxidized, and because the clays have a lot of iron in them, so they took that in, and that's kind of the results. So at the wrap-up session, you know, we tried to figure, okay, should we proceed with this conference? Should we do it again? And, you know, we strategized for the next time. And to me, one thing that came out, and Bruce, where are you? You might remember this. Steve Williams, who was a mason and an educator here, he said, hey, what do you think about that layer of dirt that's in those kilns? Maybe they buried those things to hold in the heat. And everybody sort of poo-pooed him. And I think he may have been the first person to realize, you know, that was a key component to this. So let's see. So the second kiln, probably one of the most important things was, another important thing was that the notes for that one were published in a periodical called Pottery Southwest. So right away we realized if you don't put this stuff out for other people to learn about it, it's not going to go very far. So that was a pretty key element of having these conferences. So the second conference was in May of '92. And the objections weren't that much difference, but there were a couple of ideas. One was the debate over cover sherds. So one firing had cover sherds, one didn't. The other was this idea of how do you turn off the oxygen. So what we ended up using was ash or the coals to sort of smother the fires. But those coals burnt down, and again, there was a lot of oxidation. Probably the most important outcome of that 92 Kiln Conference was that the archaeologists said, we need some guidance. How are we going to know when we encounter these things if they're kilns or not? So Eric Blenman put together a paper, and it was called Anasazi Trench Kilns, Recommendations for Excavation. So again, this was published in that same year in Pottery Southwest. So, you know, here was a thing that said, if you're an archaeologist and you find such and such conditions, here's what to think about, here's what we would like you to do, here's how we want to excavate it, and also do data analysis. Another thing that was happening at that year was there was a graduate student, David Purcell from Northern Arizona University, and he had just finished his master's thesis called Pottery Kilns of the Northern San Juan Anasazi Tradition. So in 1992, there was a total of 19 kilns that were figured like these are pretty good candidates for pottery firing. Does anybody have any idea how many kilns are out there now? It's in the thousands. So that's one of the things that came out of this conference. Let's see, another thing that happened from that year was because of this article that Eric wrote, they were doing a water pipeline replacement up at Mesa Verde. It was a big project, it went on for years. But he had, Joel Brisbane, who I think was the lead archaeologist, the principal investigator, had these guidelines, and they found 9 kilns. So in 1 year, sort of we added almost half again. And they became the best examples for stratigraphy for pottery firings. So the next kiln conference in 1993, Clint Swink, I don't think I need to do any introductions. How many people know who I'm talking about? Okay. Anyway, an excellent potter who couldn't be here today. He took the report from Joel Brisbane from Mesa Verde, and he worked backwards doing experiments on his own, trying to figure out how does this. So when he came to the conference that year, he had a scheme for what he called a limited oxidation firing. Does anybody know what that means? Or anyone not know what that means? Do I have to explain it? Okay, limited oxidation, you build your fire to heat everything. Then you put your pots down. Then you build a secondary firing on top of that, and when everything burns down, it gets covered by earth, you got it, and that should prevent that oxygen, that excess oxygen from being reabsorbed into it. So you already knew that. Okay, were you just testing me? All right, okay. Oh, okay. Well, come on up, I'll let you do this thing. Anyway, so, you know, we were on the road, but one of the problems still was mineral paint. You know, we had tried it, the mineral paint would come off, it would be red, it would be brown. So I still believe that's probably one of the biggest things we need to understand, and I think we're going to approach that real hard this weekend. So 1994, I think enough people now in the conference understood how this limited oxidation firing proceeded. So we did a couple more of those. But the questions that year were to test pottery firings in larger kilns, because some of these kilns on the landscape could be 3, 5, 8 meters long. That's a lot of pots. So somebody suggested that the Pecos Conference was happening that August, would be an ideal place to present this. And so we're talking June, May, June, July, August. People got busy making hundreds of pots. And at that, I think it was August, the Pecos Conference, for the first time in 700 years, we dug a kiln at Mesa Verde, slab-lined kiln, and fired pottery. It was a pretty popular event. There were a lot of people who came to see that. It was featured in National Geographic magazine. People took hundreds of pictures. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any notes from that. And if anybody recollects or has any of that, I would love to add it to sort of my history of this. But I mean, it was great. It had, I would say, very good, but some mixed results. Because if you can imagine firing a kiln that's from me to that second row, that's a lot of pots, and that's an awful big fire. One of the things, though, we were using was a lot of what I call wood stove wood, small pieces. I think over the years, what we've learned that consistent size of wood doesn't allow for a lot of atmospheric exchange. So I think over the times, from that time forward, we started using more dead wood, or the object was, how could the ancient people have procured wood without a stone, with a stone axe, without a chainsaw? So I think that's a good thing to think about when you're doing these. Let's see. So in 1995, again, because we were sort of nailed into this limited oxidation firings, we started to take a closer look at fuel consumption. How do we get a little bit higher temperatures? They were ranging between 700 and 800 degrees centigrade in a firing. You could get a higher temperature, but that doesn't mean the whole kiln was getting hot enough to do the work. And there was a ceramics teacher out of Wichita State University. His name was Richard St. John. And he proposed an alternate kind of firing in a trench kiln. And what he wanted to do was create a larger headspace between the pots and the fuel. So in other words, he wanted more air in there. So he had this sort of tent of fuel. And he didn't want to use cover sherds. And he proposed, let's just pull them right out. Is anyone familiar with raku pottery? Okay, it's sort of the same idea. You pull them out while they're still hot. And that sort of worked, but there were a lot of broken, cracked pots, and a lot of them re-oxidized on. But again, he was onto something that space between the pots and the fuel is important to get air in there to get them hot enough. All right, so what else? So in 96, there was a pretty severe drought in the Four Corners. So we had to reschedule that into August, which is generally the rainy season. But, again, we were using pretty consistently and working on the limited oxidation firings. But one thing that came out of that was there were some recent excavations in the Santa Fe area. Stephen Post and Stephen Lakatos presented information on what they were calling pit kilns. They weren't big, long trenches. They were sort of smaller, meter and a half, a lot of cobblestones instead of sandstone, which makes sense if you don't have that kind of geology. And their excavations showed that the stratigraphy was very similar to what was going on here. So you have to know, though, that what we're talking about is now, and anybody can correct me, 1300s, so post people living here and moving down into that area. And so they wanted to, the type of pottery, organic, black on white, organic paint, black on white, is called Santa Fe black on white. And so they proposed doing a small firing here, and it worked. So what does that mean? Okay, did people take their traditions with them? Why were they making small kilns instead of big kilns? And one of the proposals that came out of the discussions were people were starting to say, since these trench kilns in this area were often quite a distance from occupations where they're living, sometimes kilometers away, miles away, are they carrying these pots to these places, and why? Maybe it had to do with their going to where there's fuel. But anyway, a big kiln is going to take a lot of people, which might take a community, several households to make enough pots. So why are these smaller? Well, maybe pottery manufacturing and technology scaled down to be more on the household scale. And I think that's exactly what you see in most pueblos, from that time on, that people aren't just doing these big massive fires. Most families, most potters are firing their own pots. So anyway, over the years, we were very fortunate to have Native American potters invited to come as part of the conference. And the very first year, we were so honored to have, I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Naranjo family of Santa Clara. Gia Rose, she was like my grandmother. Tessie came over the years. Roxanne Swensel, who is a very famous sculptor, was here. Greg Lone Wolf was another potter, made miniatures. There were a couple folks from Zuni, Milford and Randy. Hohohai, they were here. They're pretty famous potters. And then there was Tim Wilcox, who was from Loop, Arizona. And he came, and he was so inspired that after we stopped having kiln conferences, somewhere in the early 2000s, he proposed to have a small get-together of people, which is now called the Southwestern Kiln Conference. So he was here, he revised that idea, and here we all are today. So the bottom line is the Kiln Conference brought together a lot of participants from widely varied interests and areas, ethnobotanists, native people, potters, all kinds of things. The big thing was that we always sort of worked harder to understand how is this going to help us understand the past. So, we often had pretty strict things, somebody, I got my clay out in New Jersey. No, we're trying to understand what's going on here. So that was one of the big things that I think I'm really proud to have been a part of, and it's really nice to see this whole thing coming together and growing from there. I had invited a number of people who were originally part of this, and unfortunately a lot of them couldn't make it, but Carol was here very early on, Bruce, Chris Pierce is here, he was part of them. I don't know if there's anyone else who has any recollections of some of those gatherings from back then. But Greg, what year were you here? Oh, okay, good. All right.
94 up at Mesa Verde.
Yeah, all right. And nobody took any notes.
I'm beginning to think I was working for the park at the time.
Yeah. It was such a circus that I think, everybody was just so interested.
I videotaped, I've got my
Right. Oh.
videotaped it for the park.
All right. I was trying to count in some photos, trying to count how many pots were in that. Yeah, it was. So, anyway. All right, anyway, just a recollection. Carol?
I have a lot of photos.
Yeah, I do too, but,
I thought you were looking for photos.
No, I have plenty of photos, and unfortunately, most of the photos at the time were slides. So, I could somehow digitize them, but, how that is, but,
Okay, well,
yeah.
I can show you.
Yeah,
what I
sure.
have.
Okay, yeah, it'd be good. Yeah.
So, Paul, in the first Kiln Conference, were you using cover shirts on those?
I could go back to, I just did this briefly. I could go back and say, but I think that was always part of it, because from the kilns that were known, there were random pieces. And if anybody's worked on or been to a kiln site, you'll find lots of pieces. Some of them are wasters. They look like they've blown up. Did they blow up because they were part of the firing, or did they blow up because they were being used repeatedly? So that, I think, was always a question.
We've got one kiln that was a failure. And so most of the pots were still in place and broken in place.
Mm-hmm.
Half cover sheet.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so I think, and that still holds true. I think that, some people feel you don't need to have them, and it certainly protects you from wind. There have been a number of times we fired and there's been rain. So I think that's a debate that still probably, needs some more further research needs to be done on this topic, as they say. Yeah.
So were you trying to get deliberate oxidation environments and deliberate reduction environments, or like?
Well, it wasn't understood, It was just like, how do you make a black on white pot? I think that was basically it, because, 100 years of collecting pottery sherds, here's how they look. And then as these things started to be recognized, hey, they all look alike. There's something, they must be doing a similar type of firing across the area. But I don't think, you have ceramic scientists. There was plenty written. Harold Colton, Anna Shepard, who talked about these things. But I don't recollect that we said, oh yeah, we want an oxidation or reduction. We just, but it didn't take long to realize if you have too much oxygen, you get orange,
Paul, in those early firings, was there a tracking of like the slips that were used for these?
Yeah, you had to fill out an individual form for each pot. You had to list where you got the clay, what kind of slip, what kind of paint. So we have all, years worth of records of all these pots that were made. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we did a pretty good job of trying to collect information. Now, did we make perfect sense out of it all? It's like anything. You collect a lot of data, but, there's still more questions. So, yeah. Anything else anybody wants to add, or? Okay. All right. Good. Was I loud enough just because we don't? Okay. So I think that's, Susan, you trying to set that up? Yeah. Okay. All right.
So I think what we'll do is just take about a 5-minute break.
Okay.
And so if there are other people that want to come in before Sharon comes up.
Andy?
But Paul, thank you so
Okay,
much.
great.
That was great.
And I'm going to put this right here.
Medium for my
I planned that.